So this talk is Death in DevOps. I realized my talk at Monkey was not dead yet. I'm like, there's a bit of a macabre theme kind of running through my talks. What's that? We'll get there. So, which is either going to make my like high school goth-ish self really proud, or just confuse everyone. So, where this one kind of started, I guess I'll back up. So I do product marketing at Pivotal, and one of the things, so product marketing, we kind of work on messaging and like words. So like my preferred programming language is English, and one of the things that I like to do at conferences is live tweet the sessions that I'm in, and it's a little bit like testing in production, to kind of put it into terms that y'all are familiar with, because you get some immediate feedback on like little chunks of words that you're putting out there, which I'm just like, okay, that was an interesting thing that someone said. And so this was a talk from Matt Curry, who at the time was at Allstate. He's now over at Wells Fargo, but last December he was giving a talk that was on, dialing DevOps to 11 and rainbows and unicorns and all of these mythical things that people kind of think go into it. And this wasn't on his slide. This was just something he rattled off. I can't remember if he was answering a question or what, but he just kind of rattled off like, hey, when you have an outage, here's what you need to do. And so I just kind of, tweeted it out. I noticed there was a little bit like of a blip in terms of response rate to this. So in terms of my testing in production feedback loop, I'm like, this is interesting. And I started to think about, why is this so interesting to people? And I'll get to kind of some of the other themes of what folks get to, but just to sort of put it in some personal context, this was December of last year, and earlier that year I went to my grandmother's funeral. And so my last grandparent passed away, and it was my first time going to a Jewish funeral. And I showed up, and I had no idea what to do. So the blank side is where like her memories would go, right? But there was a lot of interesting experiences that I had going to this funeral. I mean, frankly, I hadn't really gone to any funerals, let alone a Jewish funeral. So there was a lot of interesting experiences that I had there that kind of got me thinking about cultural knowledge transfer and some of the good practices that I experienced there. But then, there was also this thing that happened sort of somewhere in between, which did folks here see Coco last year? Okay. And like, did anyone else walk away from that with like, did I just watch a whole children's movie about death? And it's like, that's interesting, right? It's like, I thought it was a really good movie. But it's totally all about kind of these cultural mechanisms to handle a stressful situation and a kind of traumatic thing that happens to us all. And it's kind of wrapped into this whole story. But you sort of get glimpses into some of the Mexican and Latin American cultural ways of honoring the dead, et cetera. So this kind of idea of culture, like thinking back to why was that kind of 4-step process or just very high level kind of philosophy around how do you handle an outage, why was that so interesting to people? And I realized like at the same conference we had a keynote from Nikki Allen at Boeing, and she highlighted something that I've heard many times before, which is in all this digital transformation effort, everything, it's like the hardest thing is the cultural part, right? And she quoted kind of this book, or she referred to it, and I later found, there's a whole book with that title, which is Culture Eats Strategy for Lunch. And so, all the kind of strategy sessions that you can put together about how we're going to really change the way that we're building software and we're going to enter new markets, whatever, it's like if your culture doesn't align to that, it's not going to work. So I realized, what Matt kind of rattled off casually in his talk about how to deal with an outage, including things like, apologize again and mean it, like even after you've gone through all of the kind of post-mortem exercises, like still genuinely retain that empathy for your users who experience this outage. And it's just a very granular, practical example of culture. So this kind of got me thinking more broadly about, well, okay, so when all these folks are just all kind of, wringing their hands and saying, yeah, you gotta fix the culture thing. That's our big problem here, right? With our software organization. We don't have the right culture, and it's like they're throwing around the C word like crazy, and it's like, what do you mean by that? And I think this kind of disconnect between recognizing generally, like, yes, this area is a problem, and then practically, what are we going to do about it, is often where I think folks kind of run into a challenge, kind of bridging that gap. And so I started to sort of think about, like, okay, like, what if we kind of just keep pulling on that thread? So I'm kind of playing around here. The background image is a bacteria culture. If you look up the actual definition of culture, you get a range of things that it can mean. It's like someone who is learned in like the arts, or the kind of general philosophies and behaviors of a group or social group, or it's where you grow bacteria, or something to do with growing bacteria, because the Latin root of the word for culture is cultivate. It's related to cultivation, and so like kind of put that away in your head, because I think there's some interesting things to think about there in terms of how are you thinking about your culture as a cultivation process. Okay, so we kind of come back to death, because I promised so many people that this talk was going to be about death, and I don't want to let them down, because it's really provocative. Like, I was writing an article about this, a year ago, and I got to tell my VP, I'm like, yeah, I'm working on an article on death. And he was like, oh, okay. And then a week later, he's like, where's that death article you were working on? It's like, all right, this is awesome. And that's my son up there in the corner when he's a day old. So there's like, when you kind of look at things and the cultural anthropologist, you put your Indiana Jones hat on or whatever, and now imagine that you're a cultural anthropologist. One of these things that you find universally, and just to back up, I got my undergraduate degree in history, and I really liked medieval history, and I got a minor in classical civilization, so I really just like old stuff. But when you look at all these, when you're sort of studying things through history, there's certain kind of marking events that we often find artifacts around and references to again and again, which are sort of some of these milestones in life that culture tends to have sort of strong presence around, because they happen again and again and again, and they happen to almost everyone. Like, everyone's born, eventually everyone dies. A lot of people in between kind of have a coming of age and maybe get married, right? Some kind of union of people. And so you can sort of see the trappings of a culture by looking at these events and kind of understand some things about a culture just by like, okay, how do they handle the shipping of a new product, a new person, and like, okay, new person goes into production, great. What happens? What do we do? And then, okay, how do we end of life a thing, right? This is going out of general support. How do we handle that? And somewhere along the way, we're going to have new versions, and we're going to kind of like have a major launch. And so these are sort of these milestones of humanity. So one way I started to think about, well, culture is just maybe how we're wired socially, right? There's also some wiring physiologically to handle human events, right? Things that happen between humans. And so those are kind of we've sort of talked about the trappings of generally human events that happen to all humans. And a great example to understand like how quickly this takes hold is birthdays. So I have 2 small children, so I go to a lot of birthday parties. People didn't tell me before I had kids that part of parenthood is a lot of access to birthday cake. But like, you can go to pretty much any 3-year-old in America, and by 3 years old, if you kind of ask them about birthdays, it's going to be like cake, candles, singing, presents, and I don't know if it's just a California thing, but like piñatas are just really, really common at the birthday parties in the circles I'm in. Like I went to a birthday party with my son, and he was asking, well, where's the piñata, right? It's like for him, it's like this isn't a real birthday party if there ain't a piñata. So it's like, I paid for a piñata, I want the piñata. But that's what a birthday party is. And so I even remember with my older son, I think when I was potty training him and I was trying to like get him into like, yeah, let's go to the bathroom. I was like, oh, you have to go? I have to go too. Let's go into the bathroom. We'll have a pee party. And it's like, oh no, that's not a party. And wait, I know it's not a party, but like, tell me more. And it's like, well, there's no cake. So for him, party like equals cake. And so, and these kids know when the candles are lit, boom, you start singing. So they're wired for these sort of social interactions really early on if they've got enough exposure to them, right? And like the way it works when, you don't actually know who your preschooler's friends are because they're a really unreliable source of information when they come home. And you're like, who did you play with? And they might be like no one. And it's like, oh, actually they played with 5 kids. Like I played with Timmy. And it's like, no, you stood next to Timmy, but whatever. So nonetheless, what you end up doing is all the parents invite the whole preschool class, right? They're just like, F it, just invite them all, hedge your bets. Half of them will show up. I have no idea if my kid likes these kids, but whatever. And all the parents just kind of commiserate, and you can see drink like a La Croix in the background. Or LaCroix, as maybe how some people are pronouncing it. So anyways, like because of this phenomenon where like every kid goes to every other kid's birthday party in preschool, you get a lot of exposure to birthday parties at that age. It kind of like dwindles off as you get a little older. But birthday parties, like, man, we get a lot of practice with what to do at the birthday party. But at the end of the day, just like the piñata there is kind of, its life is sort of short, and it doesn't have much of a lasting mark on the world. When it comes to death, we actually tend to leave some pretty lasting things about how we want to remember the dead. And so death is one of those things that it's interesting on a couple levels, and one of it is because as we look back to try and understand cultures, we actually have more evidence about how they dealt with death. Like, I don't know how the Romans had birthday parties. Like, I don't know if they invited all the other kids in their, like, class or whatever. And did they have piñatas? Like, maybe. But, like, there's no evidence of Roman piñatas because they're made out of paper and, like, they would just disintegrate. But when someone dies, it's like, we're going to build a giant monument, right? I mean, to the important people. I included the Abbey at Holyrood in Edinburgh because that was the first place that I remember, like, having the epiphany where I was reading about how all the graves were deliberately facing east, right? So and kind of Christian tradition facing east, so that in the resurrection you rise and you're facing the right way. It's like, wow, okay. Like, there's a lot of thought put into, like, all these details around, this isn't just a birthday party. Hopefully you go to a lot of birthday parties, young Marcus Aurelius or whatever, but like, you're only going to die once, you're only going to get buried once, so we better do that one right. So there's a lot of kind of thought that's gone into, how folks deal with death. All right, so kind of coming back to how does this reflect in the tech world, great podcast I listened to from, a year and a half ago, so Ben Horowitz was interviewing, I can't remember his name, but this is the name of it. You can find it all included in the resources. And there was a great line in there about, culture, it doesn't matter as much with the things that are going well. It really matters when it hits the fan. I don't know if I'm not supposed to swear. I'm trying not to. uh, and so when things go wrong, right, like that's really this important litmus test to your culture is what happens when things go wrong. And so things like outages are stressful. And when people are stressed, their ability sometimes to make good decisions is taxed. And so this is where sometimes having clear rituals can help people through these stressful situations. Now, it's interesting to contrast that with Adrian's talk from yesterday about, if everyone's just following the book and the book is too static, like, things aren't going to actually work. So you need to figure out how to engage people's thinking brains, but also acknowledging the fact that, like, they're otherwise under stress, and understanding why are they under stress is kind of an important part of that, right? And when a family member dies, it's considered one of the most stressful events in your life, along with like divorce and moving houses, apparently. And it's understandable, right? It invokes all these kind of natural human feelings, like fear of your own mortality and like a sense of loss for this person you're never going to see again. And there's all these interesting modern logistics around, like, oh my gosh, how are we going to deal with like the taxes and all the accounts, to the other talk about like, have we set up everything that we needed to set up while this person was still here? Really stressful. And the same thing happens if that's happening at work, just with like a VM failed, or an availability zone went out, or something else in the infrastructure died, and it took down the application. Well, depending on how that's perceived, that could invoke a lot of these similar kind of fearful emotions, right? So looking at how does your IT department and your ops team, this is my older son. He's just exercising his privilege as a young person with a young person's body to fit into small places. Yeah, it's just very squishy. So like what I hear a lot from folks is, okay, everyone gets pulled into a fire drill call, and depending on how big the organization, there could be 200 people on this call, and there's kind of, what's affectionately known as like blame storming. And so I think of it as, everyone's kind of trying to like back slowly against the wall and sort of see if they can, if the blame can land anywhere else but on them. And what that's kind of symptomatic of is folks are more concerned with, pushing the blame elsewhere than they are about actually solving the problem. And this is probably because whether it's at that company or even previous traumatic experiences at other companies, they've learned that like the worst part about this is that someone could lose their job or have their career mobility severely impacted if that blame lands on them. And so they've got to just do that's the most important thing in the situation. It's not about figuring out what went wrong. It's not about apologizing to the users. It's not about, ensuring that this doesn't happen again. It's just get through this, get your head down, and make sure it doesn't land on you. So now, at the same time, when organizations are like, yeah, we want to adopt DevOps and we're going to, use some tools, and we want to have all these practices because we want all the benefits that we hear are associated with that. But they don't necessarily recognize, okay, what is your culture like today? You might have read about all the things that are the culture you should be getting to, but you don't know what your culture is today. Just saying, okay, we're going to start doing this. We're going to start doing blameless postmortems. But if you haven't acknowledged what you're doing today, you're kind of not really seeing yourself properly, right? Your self-awareness, your organizational self-awareness is really low. You really have to start with kind of, well, where are we today? Like, however ugly it is, what do we do? And have we acknowledged that to ourselves? Like, yes, we have a bad habit of all jumping on to a big fire drill call. Yes, we have a bad habit of, ultimately having a very short executive summary of what went wrong and how we fixed it, that doesn't actually reflect true understanding, and we kind of bury it and never revisit it again. There's a lot of these kind of bad habits. If you don't recognize your own bad habits, you're never going to be able to fix them. And by the way, just adding ping pong tables and pizza and maybe T-shirts, whatever you want to add in here, doesn't really fix that. That again, it's like that's kind of culture. These might be part of your culture. This is at our office. This is again my son attempting to play ping pong. This might be part of your culture, and it's kind of it's like the birthday party side, which can be great. But what happens when the shit hits the fan? Because that's a bigger litmus test of what your culture is. So I came across this interesting framework. This is the part of the talk where we start to venture into the self-help section of the bookstore, which is a really big section of a bookstore if you've been in like a Barnes and Noble lately, which you probably haven't because they're not around as much anymore. But nonetheless, so this is what I really liked about this is it's recognized there's like a 4 to 5 step process into making a change. And like a great example that kind of was used in this is you have all these companies in Silicon Valley that are like, yeah, we're committed to diversity. And it's like, well, you're committed to whatever you're doing now. So if what you have now is 80% white male technical staff, you're committed to them, right? I mean, and you should be because those are the people that work for you. But that's what you're currently committed to. You may want to change that, but you kind of can't say something that's not really true. Now, noticing the pattern of like, okay, this is what we currently are, right? Let's look at the data around, our hiring practices. Let's look at the data around how we deal with outages and failures. And only after you kind of study and internalize that, like give yourself some time to understand that, which is really hard to do when everyone's like, and we want to be able to revisit this in 6 months and show progress. But you haven't given yourself time to really understand what's happening in these kind of blamestorming sessions. What are the trigger points? What happens first? What happens next? Okay, that's interesting. Starting with just a lot of that's interesting before you jump into the like, now I'm going to fix it all. And then kind of slowly moving forward with, okay, one small and new intention of we're going to try doing this, we're going to try doing this. And occasionally recognizing you're going to slip off the wagon and kind of come back and recommit and understand where am I really today. And what I like about this is it's kind of like you're going all Jane Goodall on yourself and like, observe the species in the wild. The species being like your organization. So I think it's important to observe your own organization in its current state to understand what your current culture is before you have any hope of changing it. And so some examples here are like, I hear a lot about, okay, we want to focus on the team. And this is a really good practice of like, yeah, we need to orient around the team. So do folks recognize this, right? So like a boss. And it's all, it goes by real fast in the beginning, but it's his performance review. So, folks are still going in for individual performance reviews, but we're focusing on the team. Do you see where these things maybe don't line up? So I'm kind of, this one's not public yet. It's close to coming out, but I had a great interview with another user. And one of the things they worked on was they engaged with HR, and they actually changed the way that they're doing performance reviews. So they're moving away from individual performance reviews because they want to fully acknowledge it's like, no, we are measuring based on the team. We want the team working together, and not, okay, you're a team, except you're going to go have an individual performance review where you're all trying to outperform everyone else on your team. And so like another one is, hearing about, okay, well, we want to become a thinking organization, which is great, right? And it's, Leah's talk yesterday about empowerment is a great example of a lot that needs to go into creating a thinking organization. But if you're trying to be in that Jane Goodall sort of state about, well, let's maybe understand why aren't we a thinking organization today? Some questions might be, okay, so how much are you investing in enablement and training? How much exposures do the developers have to actual end users as opposed to, you know, some requirements that kind of slipped under the door with a pizza box? And it's like, you know, on the output is going to just be, you know, an app that the users want somehow. It like doesn't really work that way. So how are they able to think about and reason through what they should be building if they never actually get to hear directly from the source? What happens when things go wrong? Is it, you know, backs against the wall, protect yourself against all others? And then, of course, one of my favorites is the boss giving orders or asking questions? And so this is like this kind of trickle-down approach to, okay, everyone, I'm going to specify what everyone on my team is doing. Well, you're then not asking them to think. You're asking them to execute. And I'm guilty of this. Like just last week, I asked my team, I was like, hey, can y'all put together a couple slides that show all the great work that you did at our Spring One conference last week, because we had our big user conference. And it's like, man, I should have come at that with, hey, how would you get visibility to all the good work that you did at Spring One last week? And so I fully admit I'm not perfect at this, but I try to think about it. I'll come back to that in a second. There was also a great talk, speaking of the conference last week, from Chris Fussell, who was a special forces guy. He's left, he's written a couple books about how they had to sort of change these team orientations in the special forces from kind of the hierarchy, command and control, which was just clearly not working for them, to sort of being able to deal with a networked threat and operate in a more networked manner where there's a lot more distributed autonomy. And that's kind of a great high-level thinking talk track to think about the problem. But to me, the one that I internalize the most is around just that, am I asking questions of my team or am I giving them orders, right? And so, you know, the like mental hashtag that I'm trying to internalize now is, what would Socrates do? And you know, I'm just going to come back to the death theme because this is the death of Socrates. It's a painting. That's what they thought Socrates looked like. They thought Socrates had like a six-pack, which is pretty impressive. But anyways, like we should, you know, what would Socrates do? And so what he would probably do is like put it in the form of a question, which kind of makes you wonder, was Socrates the original Jeopardy host? And so then, that's because this is just where my brain starts going, is like, wait a minute, so should we really be asking ourselves, what would Trebek do? Like, should I be putting this in the form of a question? But it's basically like, I gotta get my team to think if I really want to have a thinking organization. And this is, I'm kind of making a jokey joke here, but I don't want to trivialize it because this is really hard. Just last week, Sophia Bright, amazing speaker on this panel we had at Spring One, also from Boeing, and she was talking about how this transformation to be a learning organization was just shaking it to the core. And she goes on to talk about how one of her biggest challenges is actually building up the confidence of people to be thinking about stuff and take that kind of ownership. And that at the end of the day, they're going to resist doing that if they're not confident that they're supported in thinking. They're not, you know, they're not going to be rewarded. They're not going to be provided with the ability to think and not have the answer be right every time. So, you know, this is kind of, I think, a big challenge, and I really think that this sort of Jane Goodall stage of just understanding where are you today is probably the most important part. But then there's some things to think about after that. And so, you know, at some point you have to start defining some new practices that you want to adopt, right? You need to know what your starting point is, which is where you are today, but then you need to start to think, where are you going to go? And, you know, I'll kind of come back to my experience at my grandmother's funeral, you know, I fly down to Australia, right, find out the news, get on a plane within 5 hours, fly 16 hours to Australia, and there's like a day before the funeral. And my cousins are there, and they've got books, and it's like, my cousin just described it as like, this is literally like being a Jew for dummies. And so it's just like, it was great, because they're like, hey, there's gonna be a bunch of stuff happening. Here's how you can kind of just get a high level view of like, what are all these things that are gonna happen? Like, why are they ripping someone's clothes? It's like, well, it means this, and it's part of this practice. So, and the other thing was, when I was there, I guess I probably had the expression of complete bewilderment, because there's like an older woman next to me who's like gently leaning over, and she's just explaining like what's going on now. Super nice, right? So she was totally stepping up to this knowledge transfer, there to assist, right? I was part of the immediate family. She was not, but she recognized like, this person seems new here. And so let me see if I can help them out. They even had little printed pamphlets with some of the kind of key things that you needed to know, and the things you needed to say. And, you know, the other thing was there was like an expression that you use, and it was, you know, we were more on the receiving end, but all the guests kind of had this expression that they use. And it's kind of a certain level of comforting words, but it's also just part of tradition. And that notion of providing people language and words that they can use in a stressful situation is really helpful, right? And so the Google SRE book, when you get to the post-mortem chapter, they actually have examples of kind of like, you know, language that's not blameless, and then here's another way to say that is, you know, positioned in a more blameless fashion, and that's that kind of example of like, okay, how can I internalize how I'm supposed to handle these situations in a different way without any examples? And getting really concrete at times is helpful. And then, you know, kind of building on that, okay, so let's define a couple new practices. Maybe we write them down. I don't know, I think Jewish people like to write things down. There was like 10 commandments, they wrote them down. It's like, so, you know, it's like, write it down. But yeah, you don't want to maybe don't write them in stone, except the 10 commandments, because they're already in stone. Someone has arrived at their destination? So then like the next stage is like, yeah, like that older lady next to me who was like, yeah, you're new here, let me help you out. And it's a little awkward because I'm quoting Adrian's talk, who's right there, but a talk that he gave last year, like, had some great examples about fire drills, right? Like, that's another, it's like, it's an emergency situation. Brains often not working, like, in the right way, which is why even, like, from small children age, we do fire drills so that in the event that there's an actual emergency, people could reasonably follow those instructions without having to fully think about them from scratch. And so how do we provide that kind of practice for people so that it's not totally new? Because we recognize when it does happen, it can be extremely stressful. And if you have no experience with it, right? If I show up at a funeral and I've never been to a funeral before, like, I have no idea what I'm doing. And fortunately, you don't really want to practice funerals, because I don't really think I need to explain that one. But actually, in the Middle Ages, right, where there was this thing called the Black Death, and about a third of Europe was wiped out in a short period of time. And there, it's like, okay, so folks are dealing with death on a really regular basis. It was clearly very traumatic to the collective consciousness of Europeans at the time. And so this sort of artistic genre of the danse macabre emerged, where a big kind of prevailing theme in it is always sort of death, who's this kind of dancing skeleton character, because why not? And is always parading off with like folks from different classes of life, right? They're very like explicit about, you know, popes and emperors and kings and laborers and like a child, and basically preparing people that death happens to everyone. It's happening a lot right now. And so let's kind of, in our own way, practice and prepare for the fact that, like, you could be dancing off with the skeleton guy sometime soon, or someone close to you. And so a way of normalizing this experience because it was happening so frequently at the time. So along those lines, when you further read on in the postmortem section of the Google SRE book, there's a lot of examples of where they're actually doing teaching and practicing. And so, first of all, this very structured way of doing postmortems, kind of the postmortem of the month, where it's not just hey, we wrote the postmortem and then we're going to bury it in the ground. It's no, we're going to feature it, a special episode of what was your favorite postmortem. And it's kind of keeping it in people's minds so it continues to be a learning experience for folks. My personal favorite was the Wheel of Misfortune, which again has a medieval reference to it, but nonetheless it's literally role-playing. So the availability theater reference from yesterday, from Adrian's talk, is kind of an analogy to theater, and this is actual theater, which is an interesting way of yeah, let's practice. Because when it really happens, just like a fire drill, it's a chance to practice. When it really happens, we don't want it to be the first time. Okay, so that's basically it. I have a couple of resources, stuff that I referred to. One, this was all based on a post that I wrote at the end of last year. And so it pretty much goes through most of what I talked about, just not in quite such a verbal way. But then the podcast, the commitment framework from a woman, Abigail Stassen. And so if you go to her site, she's written a whole book, but she's also got little worksheets, which are really interesting, and you can just download the PDFs and kind of print them out and keep them at your desk. The Google SRE book, which is free. And then I added in the Chris Fussell talk from last week that I heard, just because I thought that was interesting, and in terms of the learning process and how to shift from that command and control approach. So that's basically it. So thank you.